gunatu sahaviryam karavahai tejasrinavaditamastuva vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good morning. So our topic is nonsense words. And as the song implied, sometimes things look really kind of crazy, and yet that's kind of the beginning of the world. The world is sort of a crazy place. It's kind of a magic show, a mirage, a place where sometimes things seem to make sense, but if you look at them closely, they make less and less sense. In fact, even the topic itself, the nonsense organs, has been interpreted differently. One person thought I was going to talk about organs that weren't related to the senses, and somebody else thought it was going to be extrasensory sense organs, which is almost a contradiction in terms. But actually what we're talking about today is the fact that our sense, what we call sense organs, and the word sense then gets used in the way, you can't even talk about it without using the word sense again. A sensible reality presents to us. And so from the standpoint of Maya, our sense organs do a good job, but from the standpoint of Brahman, they do a terrible job. They're presenting a nonsense world. It's not the reality, it's a play, it's a magic show. So what is the relationship between our senses and Brahman? Well, in the Kena Upanishads, we read, "At whose behest does the mind think? Who bids the body live? Who makes the tongue speak? Who is that effulgent being that directs the eye to form and color and the ear to sound? The self, or the Atman, is the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, the speech of the speech. He is also the breath of the breath and the eye of the eye. That which cannot be expressed in words, but by which the tongue speaks. Know that to be Brahman. Brahman is not the being who is worshipped of men." And it goes on making this kind of comparison, illustrating that Brahman is the power behind the senses. It's not what the senses perceive, it's the power behind the senses. And it goes on and says, "He who realizes the existence of Brahman behind every activity of his being, whether sensation, perception, or thought, he alone gains immortality. Through knowledge of Brahman comes power. Through knowledge of Brahman comes victory over death." And so this ties into one aspect of karma yoga, where you're realizing you're not the doer. So everything your senses are perceiving and your organs of actions are doing, that's all because of the power of Brahman, not because of some individualized you. The Gita says, "This entire universe is pervaded by me in that eternal form of mine, which is not manifest to the senses." So the eternal Brahman form that Krishna is equating himself to here is not manifest to our senses. Our sense organs bring in energy signals from the environment and give us a perception of the world created by the mind. The mind has to somehow create a world out of these sense perceptions. So it's really more like a virtual reality show, that where the creators of the virtual reality use various perceptual tricks of your brain in order to make you think that you're in a particular situation. So when you're in one of those thrill rides and it makes you feel like you're falling, it's the combination of the visual cues and the sudden short drop that the little chair that you're sitting in goes through. And your senses are fooled in combining those two pieces of information into thinking you're taking a dive in an airplane or a roller coaster or whatever the virtual reality show is trying to present. So in the Gita, in several scriptures, it says that we should control our senses. The Gita says, truly admirable person controls his senses by the power of his will. All actions are disinterested. All are directed along the path to union with Brahman. And it goes on to say, renounce all your desires forever. They spring from willfulness. Use your discrimination to restrain the whole pack of the scattering senses. And in the Katha Upanishad, it says, thou, O Nachiketa, having looked upon fleshly desires, delightful to the senses, hast renounced them all. Thou hast turned from the way where many a man wallows. The man who has learned that the self is separate from the body, the senses, and the mind, and has fully known him, the soul of truth, the subtle principle, such a man verily attains to him and is exceedingly glad, because he has found the source and dwelling place of all felicity. And then it goes on to describe that the self is like the rider, the body, the chariot, the intellect, the charioteer, and the mind's the reins. And goes on to say how if the intellect and the mind are not controlling the horses, which are the senses, then it's a wild ride. So if we're not making attempts at controlling our senses, if we're suckers for the advertisers and the billboards, the little sound bites and so forth, we should really be as terrified as if we were riding in a chariot with wild horses and no reins. Or perhaps today we could use the analogy of being in a self-driving car made in a foreign country that only responds to a foreign language that you don't speak, and interprets whatever you say as some other words in that foreign language. Does the best it can, and it takes you all sorts of places you don't want to go. So this is our situation, and so we need to realize how our senses work. And I think it will help us to sort of realize the magicness of this show of Maya in order to see how our sense organs can be fooled and exactly how they work. Because for centuries, many philosophers, especially in the West and the Charvakas in Indian philosophy, have really equated reality with what the senses perceive. And so that's kind of ingrained in us that reality is what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell, what we taste, and that's reality, and that's what we really know. So our minds and our senses are slaves then to an ego sense, and our DNA is programmed for us to survive. Now you've probably noticed that we're all descended from organisms that survived. If your parents didn't survive long enough to have you as a child, you wouldn't be here. None of us have spontaneously generated from a swamp and a bolt of lightning. Now, our maybe very distant ancestor might have been, or there was a funny line in an operetta called The Mikado, where one character was extremely proud of his heritage because he could trace it back so far. And he says, I'm so proud because I can trace my ancestry back to a primordial atomic globule. Sort of takes the glamour off of say, royal heritage, which is what he was poking fun at. And so we have come from a long line of organisms that have survived. And so our DNA has programmed our sense organs for survival, not for God realization, unfortunately. So from the standpoint of spiritual realizations, our sense organs really are nonsense organs. They're presenting something else. They're presenting a different kind of picture. But from the standpoint of Maya, it's presenting a very sensible picture. From the standpoint of survival, it's presenting the picture that's been needed for probably about 3 billion years for various living organisms to survive. So let's try to increase our knowledge of how our sense organs work. And one other point that we can remember from the Gita: when understanding shines in through the senses, the doors of the body, know that sattva is present. So the situation isn't completely hopeless. Some of the things that we get through our sense organs are sattvic in nature, in that they reveal the nature of Brahman in disguise. It's where the disguise is a little thin, and you can sort of guess at what's behind it. So from the standpoint of Maya, our sense organs really are extremely remarkable. When people started to develop artificial intelligence, they realized just how remarkable it was. For example, in the idea of having a computer recognize objects, they figured it would be simple. They just set up a camera and feed the camera into the computer and do a little programming, and voila, they'd be able to recognize anything just like a person could. Well, they thought that would be a summer project, and they still haven't finished it. That was about 3 or 4 decades ago. So it's very complicated. And if you've ever had to deal with those automatic voice answering machines that want you to have a voice response, and they almost never get it right. You speak very clearly, and they still don't get it right. I don't think I understand that. It gets very frustrating. But computers simply can't completely duplicate what the human being's sense organs and mind can do. We take in a great deal of energy input and create an interpretation of it. Now, even our mind is not sophisticated enough to take in all possible sense perceptions. For example, the wavelengths of light are infinite. There's nothing in the universe that says it has to be a whole number. Frequency doesn't have to be a whole number. It's just a complete random spectrum. Sound the same way. It's a random spectrum of sounds. So we have to summarize data. You're taking in far more data through your sense organs now than you could possibly process with even your very sophisticated brain, not to mention a much less sophisticated computer. And so your brain has to summarize this information and then present it to other parts of the brain, which will then use inference to try to create a picture which will help you to survive. Now, you may not know it, especially some of you who always had sort of a phobia about math. Your brain does all sorts of interesting mathematical things with these sense perceptions. For example, when you take in perceptions of colors, most of us have 3 receptors for colors. They are sensitive in different wavelengths, and so it has to compare the sensitivity of those 3 receptors to the particular light that's coming in, and then it interprets that as a color by using logarithms. So even if you didn't know how to do logarithms in high school, your eyes have known how to do it since you were a little kid. And your ears are equally sophisticated. You get all this mixture of sound waves coming into your ear, and somehow you can identify it as words. You can identify that this was the voice of your spouse or your child, or this is a musical chord, it's a minor chord or a major chord. Your brain is having to dissect all of this incoming wavelengths. It's all jumbled up, and they use a Fourier transform in order to unscramble that and tell your brain what kind of sound is coming in. So your brain is extremely sophisticated. Even the sense of touch, which we think of as more primitive and more simple, when you begin to think of it, your touch is very sophisticated. You can determine all sorts of things with your touch. You have different receptors for pressure and temperature and texture and vibration. All these different kinds of senses of touch are all combined into, again, some sort of interpretation by your brain as to what it is you're touching. And of course, we know that people that have, say, the lack of one sense, like sight, will be able to develop their sense of touch to a much greater degree than normal people do that don't have to rely as much on the sense of touch. So we gather in a tremendous amount of information very quickly, and it's really quite impressive as how your brain then processes this. Takes in this very massive, complex amount of data. This is going on all the time. How do we accomplish this? Well, again, we have to summarize this data and then compare it to things we know and then come up with a good approximation or a good guess as to what's going on. So this sort of adds a layer to the sense of Maya that we have. And our sense organs are not uniform across all species and across all people. It varies depending on the genetics of the species, on your individual genetics, on your culture, and on the kind of exposure that you have. Just as we mentioned, your sense of touch can get more sensitive if you have to rely on it more. If you live in an environment where there are lots of shades of green, you'll get much better at discriminating green shades than somebody that doesn't live in the forest where they're exposed to all sorts of different shades of green. Just to give you an example of how amazing our visual perception is, they have what they call the RSVP test, isn't that cute? Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, where they present flashes of images to people to see how well they can perceive them. And they might do a whole bunch of images and then ask them to tell them when there is a car. It might be something like 100 milliseconds per image. And most people can do this without a problem. If you shorten it to 50 milliseconds, then a lot of people have a lot of problems doing that. But still, that's not very much time to recognize an image. And we can recognize a drawing of a car, or a shadow of a car, or all sorts of kinds of cars, because we're familiar with cars. Now, you take somebody from a culture that's never seen a car, and they're not going to be able to do this test, because their brain hasn't gotten the inferential references in order to pick out cars. But our brain is quite remarkable. And scientists have not encountered any information processing system that's capable of doing things at that kind of speed. And our sense of hearing is just as good. I'm talking on rapidly here, and I don't have to divide all my words for you to understand what the words are. You somehow are able to parse those words up and make sense out of them. But if you're listening to somebody speak a foreign language, we almost all think, gosh, why do the Spanish people always talk so fast? They're not talking any faster than we are. It's just that if we're not used to Spanish, we hear it as being very rapid because our ears haven't been trained, our mind that connects to the ears haven't been trained to parse those sounds like they do English sounds. Now, of course, we can even override that. And if you're old enough like I am, or had parents that were old enough that liked funny little jingles from the early part of the last century, we can take a sentence like, mares eat oats and doves eat oats and little lambs eat ivy, and say it very fast, and it comes out kind of jumbled and jivey. Mares eat oats and doves eat oats and little lambs eat ivy. So we can override this parsing ability of ours if we do it fast enough. All right, so basically you could say that our sense organs are tuned to the Maya channel. They're programmed to interpret things according to the way Maya wants us to interpret them. Maya is a world of our sense organs. It's a cosmic illusion. And it distracts us from the reality that's behind. Now, a magician will tell you that that's how they do a lot of their tricks. If they want you not to see something that they're doing, they will do something more interesting and more flashy or with greater motion somewhere else. So if they don't want you to see them stealthily getting something out of their pocket with this hand, they'll make some grand gesture with this hand, or they'll have their assistant do something flashy and entertaining over on the side, and you don't notice that they've reached down into their pocket to pull something else out. So Maya is like that. It distracts us with all sorts of fun things that we get deluded by, and it prevents us from turning in. Again, from the Katha Upanishad, it says, the self-existent made the senses turn outward. Accordingly, man looks towards what is without and sees not what is within. Rare is he who, longing for immortality, shuts his eyes to what is without and beholds the self. Now, you see, if you're in the state of infinite, undivided, and unchanging reality of Brahman, there is no subject, there is no object, and there is no perception. So there isn't any experiencing as such. It is experience itself. It is existence itself. It is knowledge itself. It is bliss itself. It's not the experience of anything. And so many mythologies and philosophies talk about the fact that there has to be this initial split into subject-object or some sort of duality in order for there to be a world at all. And so this duality split of the I and the rest of the universe, the it, is sort of a primal thing. And we'll see this shows up in the way our sense organs work. A lot of our sense organs work by comparing things, comparing two things, things that are contrasted in some way. And it also leads to the sense of ego. You feel like you're this and everything else is other. As the Gita says, man is deluded by his egoism, thinking, I am the doer. But he who has the true insight into the operations of the gunas and their various functions know that when senses attach themselves to objects, gunas are merely attaching themselves to gunas. Knowing this, he does not become attached to his actions. So as fantastic as our senses are, they necessarily have to be somewhat limited. And we know they're limited simply by comparing ourselves with other organisms and with other individuals. For example, we don't see in the infrared, we don't hear in the subsonic or the supersonic, but there are animals or insects that can do that do sense these things. We generally have 3 color cone receptors. Some people only have 2, and they're called colorblind because they don't see colors the normal way. But many animals only have 2 color receptors. So their world, too, is going to be more limited in the way they see the world. The show that's presented to them will be a little different. Just as I suppose we could envision different brands of virtual reality goggles that would present a different kind of show to you, depending on which brand you bought or something. Then there's some birds and some insects that have 4 cones in their eyes, so they can perceive colors in a much more intricate way and into the ultraviolet level. There is a very small percentage of people, mostly women, who also have this ability because of a chromosome on the X chromosome, a gene on the X chromosome that allows for kind of an extra color receptor in the eyes. So what we perceive is a particular reflection of reality, a particular kind of creation that our mind does out of the sense perceptions. And just by knowing how sense organs work in other species, we can see that it's a limited perspective. It's not necessarily going to be like what a dog or a bat or a bee would see in the environment. And their survival depends on different things than our survival. And so our sense organs have been tailor-made for our survival. So while our senses are remarkable, they're also limited. And it's a fantastic show, but we can't say it's either accurate or inaccurate. It just has a degree of accuracy. And you could say that's the sattvic aspect showing through, that there's something about the reality that's showing through, but some of it is veiled and that we're not perceiving correctly. For example, many of you may be blessed with 20/20 vision. I'm not, so if I don't have my glasses on, I don't see things like you do. And if you're lucky enough to have afforded LASIK surgery, your eyes might be better than 20/20. And so you've got differences like that. Or if you were around when Dobson was making people make telescopes, you might have a telescope which increases your night vision of the sky by maybe 60 or 100 times. Or you might work in a lab that has a microscope that allows you to see maybe 100 or 200 or 300 power magnification. So we can extend our senses, and we realize that we don't always see the world that way. We don't see microorganisms crawling around on the surfaces of things all the time because we don't have microscopes built into our visual system. There are other things that affect our perception as well. One of them is emotions. There was an interesting incident where a gentleman was wearing a t-shirt with a picture of a man running and a dog running behind him. And one of the people in the bus that was riding with this gentleman was amused by the t-shirt, thinking, oh, cute little thing, the man and the dog are out for a nice run on a Saturday morning. Wouldn't that be nice to be out running in the park with them? And another person who is very depressed and angry and having a very difficult day and nothing was going right was wondering why on earth anyone would have a t-shirt with a picture of an angry dog chasing a man, trying to get away from him. So our mental state projects things onto the reality, and we're all aware of that. We have good days and bad days, and some days you can handle all sorts of problems with absolute ease. They just kind of roll right off of you. And other times, if the lead on your pencil breaks, you're almost in tears. You just can't handle one more thing, right? So our emotional state definitely affects our perception. There was a very interesting experiment that they did to test whether our emotional state affects our perceptions. And so what they did is they did some sort of a perceptual test. And just before the particular questions, they would show pictures of either very angry faces or very fearful faces or very happy faces or neutral faces. And they found that what happens is when somebody was shown a very fearful face, their perception levels went up. Doesn't sound, I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you're in a fearful situation, your senses have to be more attentive. They have to be more alert to what's going on. That's a survival mechanism. We're programmed for survival. And that's how it works with your visual system. We're getting ready for the visuals here in a minute, so if you want to pull the screen down and turn on the projector. So the neurons are simply not enough. Even though we've got billions of neurons and connections up there, they're simply not enough to calculate absolutely everything that we think and that we feel and we sense. And so we have to summarize information and make inferences from past experiences. And this is why then we can be tricked. We used to have a weight. There we go. And so there's several things that we're programmed for. For example, we're programmed to detect motion. That's why the magician distracts you with extra motion. We're programmed to see faces because it's important to be able to distinguish faces when you're trying to survive in the wilds. We're also programmed to try to judge depth perception, and we use various size and other visual cues of perspective in order to determine how big things are. We also have this thing that our sense organs do work with detecting differences, and so we have, for example, neurons in the brain that detect downward motion and another set of neurons that detect upward motion. So if you fatigue one of those sets of receptors and then go to a neutral object, the other half of the receptors will be overstimulated. So you look at a waterfall and you look at this water falling. Your downward receptors are enjoying the show, but they're getting tired. Okay, everything gets tired. And so then you go to a neutral picture that's not moving. The downward neurons and the upward neurons are getting equal stimulus, but the downward ones say, oh, I'm not interested in looking at anything anymore. But the upward ones are in fine, fresh shape. They just got out of bed. And so it looks like the image is going up, even though it's not going anywhere. So we get tricked into things by this illusion. And we're going to see another illusion of an after image, which is very interesting. So our receptors for light and color get tired. And so then if you stare at something long enough and then look away, you'll see the opposite, or like a negative image. So let's look at some of these optical illusions, and just to see how crazy this world really is. Assuming the computer will work. All right, so first of all, we have several images that show that with particular shading and drawing of lines in particular ways, our eyes get fooled into thinking that things are one way, and yet if you look at this image at the bottom, it looks like 3 pillars, but if you look at the top, it looks like 2 pillars, and you look in the middle and you just get totally confused. You can't figure out what's going on. It's almost exhausting. It's kind of like a Zen koan. You look at it pretty soon and you just go, ugh. All right, so now, on page now, I'm supposed to work. All right, here's another one. Of course, the artist Escher used a lot of this kind of trick of perspective in drawing his paintings, where he'd have staircases that appear to go in the same direction and yet connect to themselves. Sort of like the steady-state universe that looks like it's expanding and yet keeps repeating, or a barber pole that always looks like it's going up, you know. But here, if you look at those, depending on which direction you're going to go up, go around the stairs, clockwise or counterclockwise, it'll look like it's either going up or down, but it just keeps going that way, and that's, of course, not possible. But it's done with tricks of perspective that are not really compatible. Two different perspectives that are not really compatible. Here's another rather common image that when we've all tried to draw cubes, I'm sure, and this one made the mistake of making the front cube exactly the same size as the back cube. So your eyes kind of go backwards and forwards to thinking, well, the yellow one's on top, to thinking the yellow one's at the back. And you can force yourself to see it one way or the other. But part of the problem is that the scale drawing wasn't really done particularly, and that this is a little distorted because the screen's not totally centered correctly. That's all right. You get the idea, I'm sure. Okay, this is a famous trick where you create a room with all sorts of visual clues that should tell you where things are and how big they are. But in actuality, those squares on the floor and the vertical lines are not at all vertical, and they're not all the same size. And the windows aren't the same size. And so if your perspective is not as limited, you'll actually see what's happening. What they do is they force you to look through this little pinhole here, and so you're visualizing this room from a very extreme angle, and you don't realize that those windows have been all slanted down like that, and the floor things are all slanted, and the man is much closer to you than the woman in the other corner. So the visual cues that we usually depend on for determining size and distance are thrown off because we assume things are straight lines, we assume the windows are all the same size, we assume the squares are squares on the floor, and we interpret it that way, and so the only other logical thing is that the people are the wrong size. Okay, so that's the difficulty there. Here's another figure that's an impossible figure. If you look at the shading here, it's almost like a Mobius strip in 3D. You've got this triangle, and the surfaces just go every peculiar which way. And it's done by tricks of shading. We also do things by comparison. For example, these two orange dots don't look the same size because the one on your left is surrounded by big dots. And so we perceive the orange one in the middle as being relatively small, whereas the one on the right is surrounded by little dots, and so we perceive it as being relatively large. I mean, this is kind of a common thing. You like to surround yourself with people that aren't as good as you are, so you look better, right? So our perception gets tricked here. Those two orange circles are exactly the same size. Now the one at the bottom is another illusion, a common illusion, which those two horizontal bars are actually the same size, but the lower one looks shorter than the upper one because of the bent-in arrowheads at the ends, whereas the one with the spread-out arrowheads make it look longer. Now you see, if you're an architect or you're on Project Runway and you're designing clothes for people, you have to know these things. You don't want to make a person or a building look funny because of the way you've designed the particular shapes and sizes and colors. This apparently has to do, and there's a lot of controversy and a lot of theories that don't explain this completely, and they like to argue about it. But the one that made the most sense to me was that if you look at the lower one, most of the black is centered fairly tight, whereas the upper one, the black is spread out. So that spreading out of that, we tend to sort of summarize information and sort of make a general impression of the whole picture. And so it tends to make the inner line spread out because the bulk of the black is spread out. And so we're fooled into thinking that the upper one is longer than the shorter one. This has been done a lot of research on to look at cultural differences in perception as well. And they find that you get better, you're not as diluted as you get older. And if dark-skinned people that have more pigments in their eyes tend to do better at this. They're not as fooled by this as other people. So they thought maybe it was cultural, and it was maybe urban versus rural. That didn't seem to pan out as well, that hypothesis. It seemed to be more the amount of pigment in the eyes seems to be the overriding effect. So again, our perception is partially genetic, partially cultural, partially our own personal experience. Oh, that didn't come out well at all. Anyway, this is supposed to be a graded background on the back. It didn't look like that on the screen. It's peculiar. On my screen, another visual illusion, my screen, it's a very nice, smooth gray background that gets gradually lighter and lighter. But you get some of the effect here. Our brain is struggling to interpret how dark the middle bar is. And because it's generally brighter on the right side, we think that that side is more brightly lit. And so the bar must be darker. Whereas on the other side, it looks like there's not much light shining on it, and so the bar must be brighter. It doesn't look very good in this picture because for some reason the projector is making it all liney. I don't know why it did that. Okay, now this one, it's not doing it on any of the other pictures. It's fine on all the others. Not here. All right, here we have some alternating light gray and black wavy lines, and they're all uniformly curvy. But if you put the dark lines connected to the white lines at the junction point, when you cross a gray one, they suddenly look pointed. Whereas if you put it on the humps, if the little black lines are on the humps rather than on just one diagonal line, then they continue to look curvy along the gray line. So again, our contrast affects how we interpret things. This is brought to light even more, I hope, in the next one, if I've got them in the right order. No, this is the after image one. All right, we're going to have you stare at this for about 15 seconds. So try to stare at it without blinking. Just looks like nothing, particularly but an ink blot. You have to stare at it for a while because what you want to do is tire out the receptors in the same place on your retina. So the white part will get tired and the black part will be getting a rest. And then when we change the screen to a completely white screen, you'll see an after image. And the first thing you'll probably notice is sort of a yellowish circle. And then if you keep staring at it, you'll notice something pop out in the middle of that yellow circle. Did I leave it on long enough? Do you see an after image? Kind of looks like, oh, maybe a Jesus figure or something, appropriate for Palm Sunday here. Jesus is hiding in the black image. All right, so we are programmed to see faces. So even though that's not a very distinct face, we kind of recognize it as a face. Now, look at this face here. This is not a face. If you look at it carefully, it's two horses. The eyebrows are hoofs. The pupils are the, again, the part of the clove, what do you call it? Clove of the hoof. Oh, yeah, it's the hoof. Okay, hoof in the leg. And it's a little bird for the nose. Again, this picture image has gotten kind of broken up in the projector image for some reason. And you got clouds and things going in there, and the mountains in the back form part of the chin structure and so forth. But since we're programmed to see faces, the first thing you see is a face. And you have to stare at it a while. All right. Here's another skull. But again, if you look at it closely, it's not a skull. It's a lovely lady looking in a mirror. And she's sitting at her cosmetic table, admiring how well she's put her makeup on. All right, but the first thing you tend to see is a distorted skull. Simply because we're programmed to see faces, because that's important to survival. And this is another image. Our brain tends to want to make things simple. Okay, we've got a lot of things to process, so we try to summarize things and make them simple. So when you look at this picture, what most people see is a white triangle on top of 3 circles and a black triangle. But that's not really what's there. What you really have is 3 Pac-Men and 3 angle signs, which somebody cleverly put together to make it look like this. Now the astounding thing is it looks like a really white triangle. It's exactly the same color as the rest of the screen. It's not whiter than the rest of the screen, but we create an edge. Our eyes are programmed to see edges. And so we create edges where there aren't any in order to simplify the picture. It's easier to see this as 3 familiar circles and 2 familiar triangles than as 3 Pac-Man and 3 angles sitting on a white piece of paper. That reduces it from 6 to 5 objects, and the objects are common objects, not peculiar objects in a peculiar arrangement. So this is the way our eyes trick us, and we can see that because we're programmed to simplify things for survival, we can easily be fooled into thinking things are different from what they really are. So let me close with a couple of quotes. Well, let's just do this one. We're running a little short time. I want to end a little early because we have a nice show coming up. This is from a book on Swami Atmavidyananda's teachings, and this is his concept of Maya. The universe as perceived by us has no independent and absolute existence. It has an empirical reality only as long as it is perceived as real by the mind through the doors of the 5 senses. Suppose we had a 6th sense, the universe would seem different. The indivisible Brahman, by contrast, is beyond the ignorant mind. There is neither time, nor space, nor causality in the absolute. It is the unchangeable reality. It is one without a second. How can it therefore be the cause of the universe? This universe is a superimposition upon Brahman. It is the creation of our mind. Whatever therefore is seen or sensed or perceived through the instrumentality of the ignorant, unregenerated mind is said to be Maya. As long as the mind remains unregenerated, it is not possible to go beyond Maya. Right, so that kind of summarizes the talk. And so we're going to end a little early. We're going to have a song and some announcements. So then we're going to have a nice shadow puppet show, which is totally appropriate. I didn't plan it this way at all, but it's totally appropriate for this topic. Because you're going to see shadows created by things behind the screen. And if you look behind the screen, especially from the side, it wouldn't look anything like the shadows. So we will be presented with a kind of magic show, in a sense. And this is a sattvic magic show, because it's coming from the Ramayana. And so you see, part of the magic show can be revealing of the nature of Brahman. So we're going to have